раздели их и приказал всем снимать штаны. И стояло две таких шеренги, и насиловали этих двух же девочек по очереди. Они начали истекать кровью, они. Вот. Потом он вынул, когда они потеряли сознание, вынул наган, подошел, выстрелил им в рот, застрелил этих двух девочек. Вот. А рядом был свинарник. Их девчонок этих бросили в свинарник. Вот.
What you just heard is the horrifying memory of a Soviet veteran who witnessed an attack on German girls. During World War II, these kinds of aberrations against women became an everyday occurrence. Both sides committed abuses that included sexual slavery in nauseating rooms, mass shootings, and torture. Sadly, many of these acts were promoted by the authorities. That is why, in this new installment of military history, we are going to tell you about the worst crimes suffered by the female population during the war. We anticipate that it will be a really hard installment and full of testimonies that will make your blood run cold, but that deserve to be told. If you were a woman in Europe in the 1940s, you were susceptible to sexual violence no matter which side you were on. That is why today we will learn stories told from both sides, with pain as a common point. The Third Reich was an empire of pain that sought to eliminate entire peoples from the face of the earth. Within the framework of torture and abuse, few groups were as affected as the women of the conquered nations. Although gender was not initially an important factor when it came to organizing the ghettos and detention centers, as the war progressed, female victims were exploited in especially cruel and aberrant ways. It all began in early October 1942 with the arrival of hundreds of female prisoners at the Majdanek concentration camp, located in the heart of Poland. On that same date, the first Frauen Konzentrationslager was created, a separate area for housing women with the aim of transforming them into slaves to the dark appetites of officers and commanders.
My back was bleeding, my knees were scraped from crawling on the gravel. And we got to an open place, an open field which was enclosed with barbed wire. There were sentries all around us in watchtowers. We were in Majdanek.
Upon arrival at Majdanek, each of the women was subjected to the selection and distribution process established by the Nazi authorities. At this stage, it was decided whether it was worth keeping them alive to perform special jobs or roles, or whether instead they were to be executed like animals. First, their clothes and personal belongings were removed. Then, their information was entered into the system to assign them a number, which would then become their new identity. Before going to their miserable quarters, they were humiliated in disinfection showers. The prisoners had to strip in front of the male SS staff, as well as in front of prisoners who helped with the running of the place. Later, we will tell you about the dark rewards that these prisoners received for cooperating with their captors. In her testimony, survivor Jadwiga Wegzeka recounted this traumatic process. One of the first things that struck us was that it was absolutely necessary for us to strip in front of all the staff. They were all men, most of them German. Resisting was our first reaction. We did not want to take off our clothes, but if we did not, they beat us and shouted at us. Already wearing their assigned clothes, they were escorted to the filthy barracks that would be their new home. Although this first encounter with the savage SS men was terrifying and disgusting, the prisoners did not know that it was only the beginning of a series of abuses and hardships that they would suffer within the camps. One of the darkest and most depraved secrets of Nazism is that, within concentration camps, such as Sachsenhausen, Dachau, and Auschwitz, prisoners of various ethnic origins were forced into prostitution. Within these establishments of terror, militarized brothels operated that had different objectives and rules, but in all cases shared the same brutality and dehumanization of their victims. The first and most famous of all the brothels established within concentration camps was opened in Mauthausen in late 1942. It was a space for SS officers and other German employees to vent their sexual desires while humiliating female prisoners.
10 girls were chosen to serve between 300 and 500 men each. The calculation was based on the maximum stamina of the female body, with the calculation of her capability for a certain amount of time. If the chosen girl failed to meet the plan, she was sent back to the camp.
The place was so successful that within a few months, similar centers were opened throughout the German camp network. In general, the brothels were built as barracks surrounded by barbed wire and large walls that kept the place isolated from the rest of the camp population. Inside, there were small individual rooms that were occupied by between 10 and 30 young and, within the possibilities offered by the context, healthy women. There they were controlled by a female supervisor who was called Aufseherin, and if you think that because she was a woman, she had an ounce of compassion for her fellow men, you are wrong. These guards were usually the most bloodthirsty and violent in the entire system of the Third Reich. The brothels operated only in the afternoon and were especially aimed at visits from SS officers. The main argument had to do with a sexual delirium on the part of Heinrich Himmler, who feared that the lack of relationships could generate contagious cases of homosexuality among the troops of the Third Reich. On the other hand, he believed that those subjects who already had homosexual tendencies could be corrected by being forced to be with a woman, a sort of conversion method. That is why ensuring a constant supply of slave prostitutes became a state policy. Some prisoners were rewarded with visits if they collaborated with special jobs or provided inside information to the authorities, but only if they were not of Jewish origin. The latter were strictly prohibited from any kind of recreational activity, and that included visits to Nazi brothels. SS soldiers had to write down their name in one of the free times that were on the place's calendar. Then, the officer chose from the photos of the available girls until he found the one that fulfilled his perverse fantasies. Finally, he paid 2 marks for a 15-minute meeting. The payment was to make the systematic violations that occurred there look like an exchange of money or a simple labor relationship between parties. Of course, the reality was much darker. Women could not refuse any of the encounters or ask for breaks.
The situation of women, when compared with their conditions in times of peace, was horrific. Every day, each woman had to satisfy 8 men, each of whom was granted 15 minutes. Privacy was out of the question. All the rooms were provided with holes through which garrison soldiers had to monitor the entire process. Talking during the act was strictly forbidden.
There are chilling stories that claim that, in addition to regular abuse and beatings, the most savage officers tattooed the words "country bitch" on the stomach of the victims, a mark of shame and humiliation that would accompany them for life in the miraculous event that they were able to survive this hell. Other women were forcibly sterilized or had abortions performed without any kind of sanitization of the instruments, which resulted in the loss of their reproductive capacities. Sexual encounters were multiple and violent, so women who were sent to the barracks were frequently replaced by substitutes due to severe cases of fatigue or even diseases acquired in the brothels. In the event of recovering from their ailments, they returned to the macabre rooms to await the visit of dozens of SS officers. If their condition did not improve, they were sent to the gas showers to end their lives as if they were an object that had exhausted its usefulness. While the Third Reich prided itself on protecting the morals and combating the savage behavior of other, supposedly inferior peoples, it simultaneously controlled a series of brothels where thousands of women were kept enslaved. Worse still, completely ignoring its racist and segregationist theories, women from communities considered inferior, such as the Balkans, the Gypsies, and even the Jews, were victims of the SS officers.
Women were almost assured that if they performed their duties honestly and well for 6 months, they might even be released. Of course, few people believed these empty promises, but there was always hope, so the women agreed to all conditions. The camp brothels lasted until the end of the war and were liquidated at the same time as the concentration camps.
Unfortunately, the Third Reich was not the only front that carried out atrocious activities against the female population. On the other side, there were men who were equally violent and savage. Soviet forces committed numerous crimes against women of various nationalities, but, for obvious reasons, the German women got the worst of it. It is known that the first cases of rape perpetrated by the Red Army occurred in March 1944 during the Battle of Romania, in the framework of the Budapest Offensive. There, the soldiers of Moscow unleashed months of fury and frustration against the women of the towns they were supposedly liberating from the yoke of National Socialism. From that battle onwards, the socialist advance was unstoppable and was accompanied by sexual violence. Within German territory, it is often said that the first massive attacks occurred on October 21, 1944, when Stalin's troops crossed the bridge that spans Lake Ungarap on the border between Poland and Germany. As they conquered territory in their long campaign to defeat the Third Reich, the Red Army carried out robbery, massacres, and mass rapes, crimes that were strongly motivated by a raw hatred of the enemy. In the eyes of the Soviet troops, on the other side was a heartless race that sought to conquer Europe, so it was not only valid but also necessary to commit acts of brutality to prevent those goals from being realized. Let us listen to the testimony of a Russian soldier who witnessed these atrocities.
Наша пехота и танкисты сбрасывают все эти повозки, фургоны, машины в кювет. И пока они сбрасывают, солдаты срываются со своих мест и начинают насиловать женщин, немок. И вот мой взвод собственный, все мои солдаты бросаются и насилуют немок.
Sexual assaults against women were recorded in numerous documents that came to light several years after the war ended. Among the most important files is a letter from an anonymous Russian soldier who speaks with savage contempt towards the enemy. "We are taking revenge for everything, and our revenge is just. Fire for fire, blood for blood, death for death." With this mindset, it becomes clearer how they were able to commit atrocities that go against all legislation on practices permitted in times of war. Although many experts directly relate the barbaric sexual conduct of the Red Army to this fierce hatred against the Germans, there are several factors that were at play when committing these crimes. Firstly, abusing the women of the enemy is a war tradition in many villages in the region. These attacks were seen as a disgusting way of establishing dominance over other peoples, humiliating the wives and mothers of their warriors. Another key factor that led to the large number of abuses carried out by the Soviets was their pathological consumption of alcohol during the war to withstand the cold and hardships of World War II. Many of the troops were on the front lines completely drunk, with their senses dulled to be able to withstand the brutality. The problem is that this sedative liquid also encouraged violence against the prisoners. One thing that the Third Reich and the Soviet Union have in common is that both strongly disapproved of prostitution, promoting laws that persecuted prostitutes in the big cities. However, while Nazism established huge militarized brothels exclusively for its soldiers, Stalin's men did not have such infamous services. In the absence of contact with women, Soviet soldiers resorted to savagery and systematic attacks on remote communities. Generally, the most violent reports came from small rural villages whose inhabitants did not have the means to defend themselves or report what had happened. Only over the years have these cases come to light as part of movements seeking to expose the abuses committed, but little discussed during World War II. But nothing is more shocking than hearing these stories from the mouths of those who lived through them. This Russian veteran recalls seeing an entire platoon attack 2 young German women.
Майор Андрианов построил всех своих штабных работников, шоферов в 2 шеренги, приказал раздеть поймали этих девочек, раздели их и приказал всем снимать штаны.
As Allied troops entered German territory during the final months of the conflict, was no longer an isolated affair, reserved for small towns. During 1945, sexual assaults by Allied forces, particularly by Soviets and Americans, increased exponentially. While there are no concrete numbers due to the nature of these crimes and the difficulty in reporting them, it is estimated that at least 100,000 women were raped in Berlin, causing an unprecedented increase in abortions and births in German hospitals. Like a wild epidemic, this wave of sexual violence caused the deaths of at least 10,000 victims, although the number expands if we consider deaths from disease, injury, and suicide. Some historians claim that throughout Germany, 240,000 deaths occurred directly or indirectly related to Allied aggression. The hardest part is that German women in the major cities of the Reich were not only victims of the soldiers occupying the territory, but their rapists were now the law. Imagine finding yourself in that terrifying position. The person who has just abused you is also the ruler of your community, dictating the new law that will govern from that moment on. This is why it is known that many young women were raped up to 50 times by different perpetrators, which makes the capture of Nazi Germany one of the largest epidemics of sexual violence in modern history. According to historian Antony Beevor, whose books were banned in Russia in 2015, there are documents that prove that the Soviet authorities were aware of what was happening to their troops. They were well aware that there were depraved elements wreaking havoc among the female population of the liberated villages, but they chose to treat that problem with caution in order to focus on the more epic and glorious aspect of the so-called patriotic war.
На дороге стоят генералы, наблюдают это, полковники, временные, дальше ехать нельзя, была загромождена дорога. Вышли. И телефонистки мои все смеются. Реакция, они матерщиницы все были.
There are records of at least 4,148 Red Army officers who were punished for some kind of sexual misconduct, which could refer to anything from a forced kiss to the rape of dozens of women. One of the clearest stories about the political circle's knowledge of these attacks involves the historic leader Joseph Stalin. In late 1944, the Yugoslav partisan Milovan Djilas contacted the main reference of the Soviet Union to report mass rapes in his country. Faced with the situation, the response he received was that a soldier who crossed thousands of kilometers between blood and fire had the right to have fun with the women he found on his way. The problem is that the idea of fun that many officers had was pure savagery and dehumanization. Usually, when we talk about looting, massacres, rape, the accounts of the Second World War focus on the activities of the Allied front that took revenge on the Third Reich in the form of attacks on civilians. However, the Nazis also took it upon themselves to spread their brutality beyond the limits of the concentration camps, especially against female soldiers operating in the ranks of the Red Army. A mixture of racial hatred, military strategy, and misogyny. Before continuing with the torments suffered by female troops, it is important to highlight the substantial differences that existed between Soviet and German troops. Within the doctrine of the Third Reich, women had no place as soldiers. Their work was limited to guard duties, surveillance, and bureaucratic roles. In contrast, for the force commanded by Stalin, women could occupy all kinds of military positions, whether as mechanics, snipers, tankers, and so on. That is why nearly 1 million Russian women actively participated in combat. Taking this into account, it is clear that the reaction of the German officers to this was first one of surprise, and then of profound contempt.
In the lens of an enemy that could barely comprehend women in uniform, the Russian women soldiers were probably the most vulnerable of POWs, ordered to be shot dead upon capture.
When the Third Reich invaded Russia on June 22, 1941, it managed to occupy large areas of territory in a very short time. This was reflected in an impressive number of prisoners, many of whom were female soldiers. It was a phenomenon that had not been encountered in Norway, France, and Poland. Hitler's officers were disgusted by these Soviet female soldiers who behaved as if they were their equal. Such was the disgust that on June 29, 1941, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commander of the Fourth Army, issued an order that all captured female soldiers were to be executed immediately and without any prior judicial process. In addition, it was insisted that such prisoners be tortured to obtain as much information as possible, since they were considered more likely to succumb to the macabre German interrogation tactics. Beatings, starvation, and sexual assault were part of the repertoire of Hitler's men. While that order was illegal and rescinded by higher authorities, there is plenty of documentation to suggest that various commanders and soldiers carried out summary executions of Soviet female soldiers caught in that period of the war. In October 1941, thousands of Russian women were captured on German soil as they were preparing for guerrilla attacks. The bravery and courage of these female warriors infuriated the Germans. Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau issued orders for them to be tortured, raped, and ultimately shot. While the Germans treated all captured Soviet prisoners inhumanely throughout the war, Russian women definitely got the short end of the stick. SS officers despised them and wanted to see them suffer at all costs, whether through abuse or humiliation. Even those who were not executed immediately were sent to concentration camps, with explicit orders to be placed in the infamous brothels we talked about at the beginning of the video. Once again, sexual violence was used as a method to subjugate the enemy and humiliate these young and fierce soldiers in Stalin's service. The cruel methods used by the Reich became known among the ranks of the Red Army. So, faced with the possibility of falling into enemy hands, many female warriors in Moscow chose to commit suicide rather than face a long and painful torment. Thus, we come to the end of an issue marked by the hardships and pain suffered by women during the global conflict. If you find this content interesting and you want to continue learning the most impressive details of the war past, we invite you to subscribe and activate the notifications of our channel. That way you can stay up to date with all our material. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next issue of Military History. Thank you for joining us.